his death in, let me just, so Henry Villard resided in Dobbs Ferry from 1879 to 1900 when he passed away. His wife resided in Dobbs Ferry until 1929. So the Villard family is an important family in our history. Henry Villard had an interesting encounters with Abraham Lincoln before he became president. Especially, those encounters are especially of interest when Lincoln was president-elect of the United States. So let's move on now. So this is an outline of the talk. I'm going to give a brief biological sketch of Henry Villard. Then I'm going to talk about his encounters with Abraham Lincoln before 1860, including his encounters during the time of the Lincoln-Douglas debates. That was 1858. Then the main part of the talk will be Henry Villard's dispatches from Springfield, Illinois, as a correspondent working for the New York Herald. He sent reports on the president-elect back to the New York Herald, and this was he started these dispatches soon after Lincoln was elected on November 6th, 1860, and he continued to send dispatches for the next few months. And there was it was a very difficult time for the United States because it seemed that the country was disintegrating. States were seceding from the Union starting in late December. This probably constituted the most difficult president-elect situation that anybody's ever had. Lincoln somehow had to deal with a disintegrating country. And then I'll conclude the talk with a brief mention of the president-elect's train trip from Springfield, Illinois in February 1861 to Washington. All right, so let's move on. All right, here's some photos of Henry Villard. The one on the top left shows him at age 13 in Germany. And then subsequent photos show Henry Villard at older ages. The only one that shows him as he looked when he moved to Dobbs Ferry is the one on the right, the older Henry Villard. All right, so his name in Germany was Heinrich Gustav Hildgard. He was born in Speyer, Germany in 1835. It's a city on the Rhine River in the southern part of Germany, then in the Kingdom of Bavaria. This photograph shows him, we'll call him Hildgard at that time, at age 13 during the time of the 1848 revolutions. Henry Villard had very difficult time with his father, who tried to impose career choices on Villard or on Hildgard that the young man couldn't accept. So he escaped from his father's rule without the knowledge of his parents and bought a second-class ticket on a clipper ship to travel to the United States, to escape not only from his parents' home, but to escape from Europe entirely. That was at age 18. As it says in this slide, he disembarked in New York. He changed his name to Henry Villard, hoping that he would thereby hide his identity. And his father was threatening to send him into the Bavarian army. So he also wanted to reduce that risk. And that was another reason for changing his name to Henry Villard. He spoke no English. He was destitute, except for $20 that another passenger on the clipper ship had lent him. This is what he writes about it. my landing upon American soil took place under anything but auspicious circumstances. I was utterly destitute of money, but had a limited supply of wearing apparel, and that not suited for the approaching cold season. And I literally did not know a single person in New York or elsewhere in the eastern states to whom I could apply for help and counsel. To crown all, I could not speak a word of English. Slowly, with difficulty, he made his way west from New York, and he had relatives in Illinois on the Mississippi River in Belleville, Illinois, which had a very large German immigrant population. His uncles and cousins were living there. And so he was able to find a place to stay in Belleville and more pleasant circumstances with family. Gradually, he took various jobs during this period of his late teenage years, and eventually became a journalist, writing for a German language newspaper in Wisconsin. Then we moved forward. So this was around 1853 when he arrived in the United States. In 1858, Henry Villard first met Lincoln. This was the time of Lincoln's contest with Stephen Douglas, contest for the US Senate in Illinois. And Villard was then a correspondent working for a German language newspaper based in New York, the Staatszeitung, which asked him to report on the Lincoln-Douglas debates in Illinois. So he did that. He sent reports in German back to that newspaper. And this is the way Villard describes it. I was introduced to Lincoln at Freeport. Freeport was the second, the location of the second Lincoln-Douglas debate in the northern part of Illinois. I was introduced to Lincoln at Freeport and met him frequently afterwards in the course of the 1858 Senate campaign. I must say frankly that although I found him most approachable, good-natured, full of wit and humor, I could not take a real personal liking to the man, owing to an inborn weakness for which he was even then notorious, and so remained during his great public career. He was inordinately fond of jokes, anecdotes, and stories. He loved to hear them, and still more to tell them himself out of the inexhaustible supply provided by his good memory and his fertile fancy. So it's interesting that Henry Villard considers this a weakness, a reason not to take a personal liking to him, but that's what he wrote. So after the senatorial election in Illinois, by chance, both men were traveling on the prairie, the Illinois prairie, and they encountered one another, going in opposite directions. They encountered one another by chance. And Villard noticed that Lincoln seemed very cold. It was a chilly day. So Villard lent Lincoln his jacket. And Lincoln was appreciative. He gladly accepted the jacket. And Henry Villard mentions in his writings that he never saw the jacket again. All right, we'll move forward to the presidential election of 1860, a chaotic election with four candidates competing for the presidency. Abraham Lincoln, Stephen Douglas, he represented the Northern Democrats. John Breckinridge represented the Southern Democrats. In that year, the Democrat Party split into Northern and Southern. And then John Bell represented the Constitutional Union Party. That was the only year that the Constitutional Union Party made a challenge for the presidency. It was November 6th, 1860. That was the election day. Tuesday, November 6th, Abraham Lincoln was elected the 16th president of the United States, with Hannibal Hamlin of Maine, his vice president. By the way, Hannibal Hamlin was a man that Lincoln had never met. This was a choice made by the Republican convention meeting in Chicago, but Lincoln had a chance to meet him during the time that he was president-elect. Lincoln received only 39% of the popular vote when he was elected president. He received the majority of the electoral vote, 52% of the electoral vote. Here's the way the electoral map breaks down. We have Lincoln winning almost every state in the North. We have Breckinridge, the Southern Democrat, winning almost all the Southern states. And the Constitutional Union Party was able to win the electoral votes of 3 states, Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee. Douglas, who actually did relatively well in the popular vote, won only a few electoral votes, Missouri, and a few in New Jersey. All right, so we're in 1860, and by this time, Villard was writing his newspaper articles in English. He did remarkably well in acquiring the English language in a few short years, and he acquired it well enough so that he could write coherent, well-phrased articles for newspapers in English. He was working for the New York Herald. Here's a picture of the publisher of the New York Herald at that time, James Gordon Bennett. Bennett sent Villard to Springfield, Illinois in that November when Lincoln was elected to report on the new president-elect. And I'm going to come back to this slide after I finish the brief biographical sketch of Villard. So right now we'll continue with the Villard biography, and we'll come back to this slide when that biography is finished. Okay, so here's the biographical sketch part 2. Villard continued to work as a newspaper correspondent, writing articles in English. And by the time the Civil War broke out, Villard was working for the New York Tribune with Horace Greeley of Westchester, the publisher, Horace Greeley of Chappaqua. As a correspondent, as a war correspondent, Villard was present at an astonishingly large number of battles in the Civil War, including Bull Run, Fredericksburg, and the Wilderness, the Battle of the Wilderness. In 1863, Villard took a break. He was given a couple of weeks vacation by the New York Tribune. He went up to Boston, and there he met William Lloyd Garrison, members of the Garrison family, including Garrison's daughter, Helen Francis, whose nickname was Fanny. And one thing led to another. And here's Fanny with her father, about age 18. One thing led to another, and Villard and Fanny were married in January 1866, after the end of the Civil War. Villard returned to Germany because he heard that his older sister was sick, was dying of tuberculosis, consumption as they called it. And he he visited Germany several times during the mid and late 60s and early 1870s. And eventually he was able to make connections there with German financiers who were interested in investing in railroads in the American West. And through these connections and through his travels in the American West, serving as an overseer for the investments of the German financiers, Villard was able to acquire, through his investments, the Northern Pacific Railroad. He gained control of the Northern Pacific Railroad by 1883. And he created a link between the Northern Pacific and the Oregon Railway and Navigation Company, and thereby completed the first Oregon transcontinental connection that was completed in western Montana. This was not the first railroad that, the first connection, transcontinental connection with the United States. That was in Ogden, Utah some years before. But this was the first that went to Oregon. Here we have a artist's sketch of ex-President Grant driving the last spike of the Northern Pacific Railroad in Montana. A nice sketch. I think it shows Villard actually. Villard is probably a bit older than he appears to be in this drawing. I think Grant is made to look younger than he actually was in 1883. In 1879, as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, Villard purchased property in Dobbs Ferry. Here's a view from that property. He built a villa there. The property is was located along Judson Avenue, going south towards Hastings. And Villard continued to show interest in entrepreneurial undertakings. He wrote to Thomas Alva Edison in 1886 this little letter, confidential. Gentlemen, as you have been advised by Mr. F.R. Upton, I've been engaged for some times past in an effort to bring about a revival of the Edison electric light interests in Europe and elsewhere. So he became a venture capitalist supporting Edison's electric company. In 1881, Villard purchased the New York Post and later that year, The Nation, the magazine, The Nation. He was a philanthropist on a large scale in America and also in Germany. He contributed funds that allowed the University of Oregon to build its first buildings, and one of its first buildings they named for him, Villard Hall, on the campus in Eugene, Oregon. And here is the gravestone of Henry Villard. He died in 1900, and this gravestone is located in Sleepy Hollow Cemetery. The Villard family continued to live in Dobbs Ferry from 1900, the time of Villard's death, until 1929. Oswald Garrison Villard was took over control of The Nation and the New York Post, and he can be arguably considered the founder of the NAACP in 1909. He wrote an appeal for support of Blacks who had been were suffering from uprisings, riots. There was a riot in Springfield, Illinois, against the Black population in 1905 and 1906, and that was what triggered the idea that an organization should be set up to provide legal assistance to Blacks who might be threatened with violent attacks. Fanny Villard was a leader of the women's suffrage movement and a pacifist, and so they were known on a national level as activists during this period. Now we'll go back to Henry Villard and his meeting with Abraham Lincoln when Lincoln was president-elect in Springfield, Illinois. Bennett, the publisher of the New York Herald, sent him to Springfield to report back on the president-elect Lincoln. This is what Villard writes about that assignment. I had not got over the prejudice against Lincoln with which my personal contact with him in 1850 imbued me. It seemed to me incomprehensible and outrageous that the uncouth, common Illinois politician, whose only experience in public life had been service as a member of the state legislature and in Congress for one term, should carry the day over the eminent and tried statesman, the foremost figure indeed in the country. Here he's referring to William Seward, who was had been governor of New York and was a senator, Seward was expected to get the Republican nomination in 1860, but Lincoln was able to defeat him. Meanwhile, the secession crisis is ongoing. And here's a map of the various zones of states that were involved in at the time of this crisis. You can see the lower South, South Carolina in the east was the first state to secede, and Louisiana and Texas were the last two states to secede of the lower South. Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas seceded only after the attack on Fort Sumter. And then we have the border states, Missouri and Kentucky and Maryland, who were teeter-tottering, where a lot of sentiment that was pro-Confederacy, and it was Lincoln's task as president to do everything he could to prevent Kentucky and Maryland and the other border states from going over to the Confederacy. Here are the dates for the secession of the lower tier of southern states. South Carolina was the first, December 20th, 1860. And Texas was the last of the seven, February 1st, 1861. Here are some of Villard's reports on the new president-elect. First, he described the setting where the president-elect was seeing visitors. It was the reception room of the Illinois governor in the State House of Illinois in Springfield. Limited as the space required by the lean proportions of the president is, it was a most difficult task for him to find standing room. By constant entreaties to make room, he positioned himself by the door so as to be able to shake hands. So the security provided for the president-elect was like zero. Anybody who wanted to come and take a look at the president-elect or speak to him or shake his hand could come. There appeared to be no security provisions at all. Villard continues to write, the president is frequently driven to the wall. The curious defile past him, and after squeezing the presidential fingers, settled either onto the sofa or chairs, or remained standing for protracted observations. Only after having stared with open mouth to their heart's content, many employed hours in that agreeable pastime, would they move out of the room to enable others to gain entry. A tight jam prevailed, therefore, all day around the president, who found himself frequently driven to the wall. Quite an unimaginable situation. Abe is putting on airs. His old friends said that Abe is putting on airs. His old friends who have been used to a great indifference as to the outer man, in other words, his clothing and his appearance, now say that Abe is putting on airs. By this, they refer to the fact that he is wearing a brand new hat and suit, and that he has commenced cultivating the, for him, unusual adornment of whiskers. Villard writes, Fifth Avenue snobs would be horrified. But these outward embellishments notwithstanding, a Broadway tailor would probably not feel tempted to consider Lincoln as coming up to his artistic standards. The angularity of the presidential form precludes that. We venture to say that Fifth Avenue snobs, if unawares who he was, would be horrified at walking across the street with him. Always cadaverous, now almost ghostly. These are quite interesting descriptions. Mr. Lincoln's personal appearance, always cadaverous, is now almost ghostly. His present position is wearing him terribly. Letters threatening his life are daily received from the South. So here are some of the adjectives that Villard used in order to write his articles for the New York Herald. Angular, lean, cadaverous, almost ghostly. The gawkiest, dullest looking boy you ever saw. One garrulous old lady said she well remembered Abe when still a boy in his old home in Kentucky. she expressed astonishment at his elevation to the highest office in the land. Why, she said, he was the gawkiest, dullest looking boy you ever saw. But she added, there was one thing about him. He could always remember things better than any other boy in the neighborhood. Then on November 21st, President-elect Lincoln traveled to Chicago. Actually, the reason he traveled to Chicago was to meet the vice president-elect, Hannibal Hamlin. He thought it'd be appropriate to meet him. Reasonable idea. So he arranged to have Mr. Hamlin come to Chicago. Lincoln himself would go to Chicago, and there they met. Mr. Lincoln purchased his train tickets and traveled in a crowded and inconvenient car. Like other Democratic sovereigns, neither the company nor the conductor showing him any courtesy whatsoever. Although the same corporation recently treated a foreign prince, that was the Prince of Wales, to a special train over their road. Prince of Wales, the son of Queen Victoria, who later became King Edward VII. It gets worse. Iron convicts, one a murderer. The conductor permitted iron convicts, one a murderer, to enter the car and to take seats between the families of Mr. Lincoln and Senator Trumbull. Lincoln and Trumbull traveled together in their families. They traveled together. The sheriff having the culprits in charge is a Douglas Democrat. All right, so Villard writes descriptions like that about Lincoln's physical appearance and the lack of security, but he also tries to discern the implications for the nation. What kind of a president is this man likely to be? And he changes his point of view to some degree over a period of several weeks. So I'm going to try to show how that happens. November 19th, he has a very jaundiced view of the prospects, of the implications for the nation of having this strange kind of person as president. But by December 7th, he's mellowed on Lincoln, and he thinks perhaps Lincoln will do okay after all. So here are some of his comments. First, November 19th, he is not firm. The present aspect of the country, I think, augurs one of the most difficult terms which any president has yet been called to weather. And I doubt Mr. Lincoln's capacity for the task of bringing light and peace out of the chaos that will surround him. A man of good heart and good intention is not firm. The times demand a Jackson. So pretty negative outlook for the country, according to Villard on November 19th. And he mentions the growing gravity of the national crisis on November 22nd. Stubborn facts of the most fearful portent were daily developed since the eventful 6th day of the month when Lincoln was elected. He could not possibly shut his eyes to their growing gravity. And he mentions that Lincoln is being urged to give conciliatory assurances to the South to calm the waves of Southern excitement. Even among his own political adherents, many Union-loving men exhorted him to yield. Lincoln refused to give those conciliatory assurances, however. This is what Lincoln wrote during this period. First, I could say nothing which I have not already said and which is in print and open for the inspection of all. To press a repetition of this upon those who have listened is useless. To press it upon those who have refused to listen and still refuse would be wanting in self-respect and would have the appearance of sycophancy and timidity, which would excite the contempt of good men and encourage bad ones to clamor more loudly. So this issue is still debated by historians. Should Lincoln during this period have offered more conciliatory gestures towards the South? There are points to be made on both sides. Maybe we can discuss that at the end. So again, we have Villard writing his dispatches. His ever-ready wit and honest frankness. He's getting softer now on Lincoln. The best evidence for Mr. Lincoln's popularity in this vicinity where he has lived for nearly 30 years is furnished by the fact that it is nearly impossible to converse with any old resident about him without eliciting one or more stories illustrative of his ever-ready wit, inexhaustible humor, quick repartee, honest frankness, and good understanding with everybody. And again, what are the implications for the nation of having this man as president? Giving him credit for sincerity of purpose. None passes out of his out of his reception room. This is December 7th, when Villard is beginning to feel that maybe Lincoln will be able to handle the problems after all. None passes out of his reception room without being firmly convinced that he intends to sink the man in the public office, the partisan in the patriot, the Republican and the faithful protector of the federal laws. This being the case, it only remains to be seen whether circumstances will not prove too strong for him, whether he will simply float on the current of events or prove able to direct their course as far as his official power goes. Giving him credit for sincerity of purpose, we only know Lincoln as a good debater, a well-informed politician, and a sound lawyer. All he does and thinks bears the stamp of conscientiousness and solicitous dutifulness. The daily observer of Mr. Lincoln's doings could not resist the impression that all he does and thinks bears the stamp of conscientiousness and solicitous dutifulness. What his executive abilities are, we still have to learn. These are great and perilous times, and great must be the man for them. The stuff of which he is made must be as stern as the aspect of our days. Mediocrity will no longer do. There are dormant qualities in old age which occasion will draw forth and develop. The innermost resources of the highest statesmanship will be required. Difficulties will have to be looked squarely and boldly in the face. This is the key sentence now, which shows Villard is starting to have more confidence. Having observed him since the election, I dare say that there are dormant qualities in old age which occasion will draw forth, develop, and remind people to a certain degree of the characteristics of old Hickory. That's Jackson again. So earlier in November, he was saying that we need a Jackson, and he's no Jackson. He's not firm. Now he's saying that perhaps he will show those characteristics of firmness, just like Jackson did. So I'm just going to conclude with mention of the train trip that Lincoln took from Springfield, Illinois, to Washington, D.C. This was entirely in February 1861. And you can see from this map that there were 93 stops for that train, including some very large cities. Indianapolis, then into Ohio to Cincinnati, then Columbus, then east into Pennsylvania, into Pittsburgh, then going back from Pittsburgh west towards Cleveland, then up along the shore of Lake Erie to Buffalo, then across to Albany, then down along the Hudson past Peekskill, Dobbs Ferry to New York City. And that's where Villard got off the train, because his employment was with the newspaper in New York City. But the train went on to Philadelphia, and then there was an episode where Lincoln put on a disguise in order to reduce the chance of being waylaid in Baltimore. According to Pinkerton, the detective, there was a high risk of a threat to his life in Baltimore. So he went in disguise through Baltimore in the middle of the night, and the newspapers had a field day with us. And Lincoln later on regretted that he did this. There were two very significant speeches that he made during this trip from Springfield to Washington. The first one is his farewell address, and I'm going to read that to you. I'll close off with these two speeches. The first one, the farewell address. This is when he left at the train station, February 11th. No one, not in my situation, can appreciate my feeling of sadness at this parting. To this place and the kindness of these people, I owe everything. Here I have lived a quarter of a century and have passed from a young to an old man. Here my children have been born and one is buried. Now I leave, not knowing when or whether ever I may return, with a task before me greater than that which rested upon Washington. Without the assistance of that divine being, whoever attended him, I cannot succeed. With that assistance, I cannot fail. Trusting in him who can go with me and remain with you and be everywhere for good, let us confidently hope that all will yet be well. And so that was when he left Springfield, February 11th. 11 days later, he was in Philadelphia raising the flag at Independence Hall in front of a large assemblage of people. And he gave this speech at Independence Hall. I have not had a feeling politically that did not spring from the sentiments embodied in the Declaration of Independence. I have often inquired of myself what great principle or idea it was that kept this Confederacy so long together. It was not the mere matter of separation of the colonies from the motherland, but that sentiment in the Declaration of Independence that give liberty not alone to the people of this country, but hope to all the world for all future time. It was that which gave promise that in due time, the weights would be lifted from the shoulders of all men and that all should have an equal chance. So this is Lincoln exhibiting his poetic prose at its finest in those two speeches. And okay, so that's it. All right, so ready for any questions or comments?
Okay, I don't see any in the chat, but I had one. Did Villard continue to follow Lincoln and report on him in the presidency?
No, Villard became a Civil War correspondent. So he was busy on the various battlefields of the war. Villard became quite prominent as a Civil War correspondent. He was highly regarded by the editor, Horace Greeley of the New York Tribune, and he became very well known in the country. It helped him introduce himself to the Garrison family and to Fanny Villard. He was already known to them because of his fame as a correspondent for the New York Tribune. So to the best of my knowledge, he didn't have any occasion to see Lincoln in the White House.
Okay, I invite people to unmute themselves and just jump in with a question if you have one. Oh, here's one in the chat. Are there any Villards still alive today?
Well, I'm going to stop. Should I stop share screen?
Yes, please.
Let me do
Good
that.
idea.
Okay, that way I can see everybody. Okay.
So Ariella asks, are there any Villards still alive today? I wonder if there are any Villards attending today.
All right, well, I can answer the first question. Henry Villard's great granddaughter, I believe she is, Alexandra Villard de Borkow, wrote an excellent biography of her great-grandfather. It's called Henry Villard Titan. People interested in this figure, Henry Villard, I highly recommend this biography to you. So, but I'm sure there are others. Oswald Villard has descendants that are living today. I think some became professors.
I have a question.
Yes.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I had no idea the connection between Villard and Lincoln, which was very interesting. But I actually have a question directed to the folks in the Dobbs Ferry Historical Society. What happened to Villard's estate in Dobbs?
It was sold in 1929 by Oswald Villard. It was after his mother's death in 1928. He sold the estate, and it was broken up into lots. The present lots that we see on the south side of Judson, for example, and going down along Villard, is it Villard Avenue or Villard Street and into Hastings. So it was developed.
Goes along Clinton. It goes along Clinton Avenue into Hastings.
Was the house demolished?
Yes, everything was demolished except there's a tea house. Looks like a gazebo, which still exists. It's on Judson. It's private property. So it's in the yard of people who reside there on the south side of Judson.
Thank you.
As far as I know, all the other structures, there were quite a few structures on that property when the Villard owned it. But as far as I know, they've all been demolished except for that tea house.
Well, here's a good question.
Yes.
And this is something that I've wondered, why is Villard Avenue in Hastings and not in Dobbs Ferry? Or was Clinton ever called Villard and then for some reason it got changed? Do you know?
Well, I don't know the answer to that, but that's a very reasonable point that you're making. I don't know what can be done about that, Ellen.
We've got some other history mavens here. If you know the answer, Martha?
I think it was the approach road to the estate, because once you crossed over into what is now Clinton Avenue, the line between Villard and Clinton, then you were actually into the driveway of the old estate. So I think that it was probably called Villard Avenue because that was the approach road.
Oh, Martha,
Villard's Tea House is on property that was owned by the Persinger family.
Oh, right.
Mildred talked about it as Villard's Folly. I thought that it's like a gazebo, and it was owned by Mildred Persinger until she passed away. I don't know who took over the house, but that gazebo is still.
Is that on Judson?
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's the surviving structure that I was referring to a few minutes ago. Looks like a gazebo. It was described as a tea house.
Connie?
Oh, yes. First of all, thank you, Richard. This is really great. I'm really interested in Villard's take on the humor of Lincoln. I'm sure many people have read Doris Kearns Goodwin's take on the very subtle, purposeful use of humor that got Lincoln through so many problems. So I was just curious if any of you, Richard or Ellen or anybody, has a sense of, did Villard miss it? Did he just not really get that Lincoln was very purposeful? At least that's the way I guess I was convinced by Doris's take on it. Anyway,
Yes,
great topic.
I think, Connie, I think that based on the biography that I referred to a few minutes ago, I think the explanation may be that Villard was imbued with old country etiquette and class consciousness. His great-granddaughter describes him as being very much class conscious. And so his objection to these anecdotes and jokes and this raw humor may be an objection to low class behavior.
He mentioned, yeah, that's interesting. He does mention the snobs. What does he say? The snobs on Fifth Avenue. Like maybe he thought, yeah, well, he was one. But the last half of that question, I guess, is didn't Fanny coming from the Garrison family have a little more sense of not being a snob and, equal rights and fairness for everybody. A little different.
Yes, definitely. I think it was very hard. I suspect it was very hard for Fanny to convince Henry that women should vote.
Yes, we know, right.
This was a
right.
major issue for her.
Yeah,
And
Right.
I guess he went along with it. What am I gonna do? This is America. I have to accept these radical ideas. But
Well, it's interesting.
Also-
We know that Fanny came to Irvington to the Town Hall Theater when a famous singer was raising money there for the suffragettes. I mean, I guess they weren't really called suffragettes. That's what we call them. So we know Fanny was certainly very supportive. But yeah, that's interesting what the dynamic was in the family. Anyway, great talk.
well,
Thanks.
yeah, Henry Villard was definitely a reformer. He was strongly anti-slavery.
Yeah.
His German relatives in Illinois were, and many of those German immigrants were left Germany in the wake of the failed 1848 revolutions. So they were hoping to establish republics in Germany, or democratic republics, and instead the oligarchy won. And so they left with great disappointment. They left Europe and came to America, where they were appalled at slavery, the existence of slavery. We came to a free country, and here we have this slavery. They knew that before they came, but it was very hard for them to accept seeing it in action. So they were strongly anti-slavery in general, the German immigrants, as well as I say, as was Henry Villard. He wasn't reactionary.
Okay. Just a stop.
certain social attitudes that he wasn't quite able to accept.
So I have a couple comments. Vicky Jones did convey the news of this event to some Villards who shared it with Alexandra and her brother. So if any Villards are here today, please let us know. I don't know everyone on this call. And Sarah asks, wasn't most of Fanny Villard's work as a suffragist after Henry's death?
Oh, yeah.
Well, that's most of her efforts on behalf of the suffrage movement that I'm aware of occurred after 1900. Yes, after
Yeah.
right. Well, that's when the suffrage movement became very active after 1900. So she was also a major leader of the peace movement, especially during when World War I broke out in 1914. There were a demonstration. She was a leader of a women's peace march in New York City. The United States was not in the war, but they were concerned that the United States might be drawn into it. So they had a very large women's peace march in the summer of 1914, and she was one of the leaders of that.
The Hastings Historical Society would like us to know that they, on their website, they have a blog post about Lincoln's inaugural train trip. So if you'd like more information, I don't know if you saw that, Rich. I haven't seen it, but good to know.
One thing I wanted to mention, I forgot to mention in my talk on that, that's regarding that inaugural train trip. Lincoln had vast throngs of people turn out, very enthusiastic supporters in the major cities. 100,000 people turned out in Cincinnati. And city, a 250,000 people turned out to see the president-elect. 250,000 described as unenthusiastic. In the Midwest, not only large numbers of people, but also enthusiastic people. New York City was not strongly pro-Lincoln at all.
Right.
New York City had strong commercial links with the South. They would ship cotton to Europe from New York City. They would finance enterprises in the South. And so the departure of the Southern states would be a financial blow to New York City. So they weren't particularly enthusiastic about this anti-slavery president who was elected.
Here's a question from Ernie. Did Henry Villard ever meet Frederick Douglass?
Henry Villard met a lot of people. But I can't say for sure. I haven't seen that
Look up.
reference one way or the other as to whether he might have met Frederick Douglass.
Blight, yes,
Blight, yeah.
David Blight.
I don't know the answer either, but we had a speaker in Irvington. We're just trying to remember Blight, who wrote a very impressive biography of Frederick Douglass. So
Yeah, so
I don't have it. I didn't buy it. Maybe somebody else.
I actually have it, and since it's on my Kindle, I could actually search to see if he has mentions Villard,
Right.
but I don't remember that.
I don't either.
Let's see. Oh, I was told that Fanny was friends with Mrs. Franklin Q. Brown. You know, the Browns were big, you know, the president of Dobbs Ferry and his wife and great benefactors. Do you know if Fanny and, oh, what was her name? Ida? I forget her name. Were friends?
I'd have that.
I don't know. I don't know.
Well, that's
They were the same period. They had to know each other if they were both living here in Dobbs Ferry
Yes.
in estates that were practically adjacent.
I think, I can't remember exactly, but when I wrote the article about the suffragettes hearing Lily and Nordica, and it's in the Roost somewhere, but I don't even remember, but I put a bunch of the names of the women who all together were the local supporters of the suffrage group that they were raising money. So maybe the name Brown is in there. It's somewhere on our Irvington Roost.
Go to the
Go
website.
to the Irvington
Go to
website.
the
I can't
website,
remember
yeah.
what I wrote.
Yeah, well, that's the problem. I have that same problem, you know, I forget.
So.
We did that whole big Fanny Villard event, you know.
Yes,
the
we were
evening
there.
Mrs. Villard invites or something.
Mhm.
And I knew a lot at that time, but what was that, 10 years ago?
Yeah.
Well.
Okay, Zoom user has her hand up. So
Yes.
Zoom user, let's hear from you.
Hi, I'm Miriam, and I wanted to know, the presentation spoke about Lincoln having a different vice president than the one I seem to remember in my history. And I'm wondering, the story doesn't quite bridge how that changed.
Second.
All right, I can explain that.
That's easy to do.
Bill Hamlin was Lincoln's first vice president from 1861 to 1865. But in the summer of 1864, Lincoln looked ahead towards his prospects for re-election in November 1864, and he thought his prospects for re-election were bleak. It was basically because of failures on the battlefield. It looked like there was no prospect of the Union winning the Civil War. And so Lincoln fully expected he would lose in November to the Democrats who would accept Southern secession. So he was desperate to do things that would increase his chances of winning the election in November. So he decided to drop Hamlin and take Andrew Johnson as his vice presidential running mate. Johnson was a Democrat. He was from the South. He was from Tennessee. And through this desperate measure, Lincoln thought he might have a better chance of winning the re-election. This was perhaps one of the saddest decisions in American history. Is Johnson was so hostile to any reasonable actions in Reconstruction, so hostile to African Americans. Whereas Hannibal Hamlin would have been totally different, I'm sure, if he had been president. So this is an unfortunate decision. I don't think that Lincoln preferred as a person or as a politician, Johnson, but he was desperate, and that's why he did it.
Thank you. I really am fascinated. I'm also fascinated by how involved in history that I read in history books. Dobbs Ferry is involved. The whole
I
river
was
is
involved in everything, yes.
amazing.
Revolutionary War, Civil War, you name it.
It's absolutely amazing.
Yep.
So I can't see both screens. We have a ton of people here. So if you have raised your hand, why not unmute yourself and just jump in? I don't see any more questions. I guess,
Helen,
yes.
this is Jean Cecilini. How are
Hi,
you?
Jean.
Hi. I know there are buildings in Manhattan on Madison Avenue between 50th and 51st Street, I believe, behind St. Patrick's Cathedral. They're referred to as the Villard houses. I
Yes.
just wondered, was that where they lived when they didn't live in Dobbs Ferry?
Yes, thank you for that question. That's a good point. They considered Dobbs Ferry, Thorowood and Dobbs Ferry to be their country home. And their city home
Right.
were the buildings that you alluded to in Manhattan. So they had both homes, at least during the time that Henry Villard was alive.
Right.
After his death, I don't know. They might have no longer had the New York City home. So that's the explanation but according to the author of the biography of Henry Villard, their favorite home was the Dobbs Ferry home.
But of course.
I thought he had some business reversals at one point, and they actually lost the Villard houses,
In New York.
or they had to sell part of them and keep, it's a big horseshoe-shaped complex. And I don't know if they always occupied just one little section, but either they had to scale down there or they lost it entirely because of finances,
Mhm.
as I remember.
Yes, that's an important part of the Villard financial history, was his competition with J.P. Morgan for the Edison Electric Company. Edison and Villard were the trustees of the Edison Electric Company. J.P. Morgan wanted control of that company, so he was able to engineer a hostile takeover. And Villard and Edison lost control of the Edison Electric Company, and the new company was called General Electric, which you might have heard of. That was J.P. Morgan's name for the new company. So Edison was connected with it only by historical links, no longer had any financial stake in the company. It was rough. It was rough competition. Yeah. Yes.
Oh.
Is that
And, I just like to throw out there, I've been watching the Gilded Age on HBO, and it really delves into some of these robber barons, and they're based on real people like Vanderbilt and Gould. And I found it fascinating because I also listened to the official Gilded Age podcast, which you're supposed to listen to after you've seen the episode. And it's fascinating about the background of the racial relationships and the new rich versus the old rich. So just, since we're talking about this era, just want to plug that show.
I saw Carl Shapiro raising his hand.
Oh,
Yes, can you hear me?
yes.
Yes.
I'd like to relate an anecdote of Abraham Lincoln, and this comes from my friend Bob Blau, whose father used Lincoln's humorous anecdote in a situation that he was involved in. He was at his future in-laws' home to get introduced to them, and they had a little gathering, and the question was asked, what beverage would people want? And so Bob Blau's father asked for coffee or tea, and he tried it, and he said to the hostess, said, if this is tea, I want coffee. And if this is coffee, I want tea. And that anecdote has the origin in Abraham Lincoln.
Well,
He-
that's a clever,
Thank you.
clever remark for sure. Not too complimentary to the host, though.
Okay, well, any more questions? This final call for questions or comments. Well, it's been great to see y'all here, and thank you, Rich, for a wonderful presentation.
Yes, thank
I
you
have
very much.
recorded it, so if anybody cares to watch it again, let me know. And thank you for coming. We have another event in 2 weeks on March, whatever that Sunday is. It will be at 2:00, but I don't have flyers yet, so just stay tuned.
All right,
We
thank
hope
you
to
for
see
the
you
opportunity. I
again.
appreciate the opportunity that the Dobbs Ferry Historical Society gave me to prepare this and to update myself on these interesting topics.
Well, thank you.
Thank you,
for
Richard.
all that
Thank you.
scholarship.
Richard.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.